est-ce que je peux revenir sur les questions
Can I
pour moi centrales
maybe come back to a slightly less important issue, the role of the energy crisis in the current financial
and I'll start
crisis?
with a little preamble about how I arrived in the Middle East as a very young correspondent in the early 70s and made an astonishing discovery by going to Saudi Arabia, which was that the oil companies there were imposing quotas on production in order to help consumers. They were not, in fact, gouging all possible profits, but they were managing their industry in a way that kept oil prices and gasoline prices down in the United States in particular. This was an astonishing discovery, since I'd assumed, as most Americans do, the reverse. That came to an end shortly after I arrived in the Middle East. There's not a cause and effect relationship there. But when the producing companies took control and began to impose their quotas to raise prices for consumers. But we did have a long period where oil companies functioned essentially as an agent for the consumers. They have now had to adjust to become agents for the producers in many ways. And that's contributed, of course, greatly to the volatility, the increases in prices. Est-ce que vous voyez une porte de sortie de ce système de
Do you
prix
see any
volant,
possible
crashing,
solution
rising? Et quelle est
to
cette
this
sortie?
price volatility?
Ça, j'adore cette question, même si je vais un petit peu vous
Yes, I
décevoir.
really love this question, even if I might disappoint you to some
Ce côté
extent
noble et généreux des compagnies pétrolières
on the
dans
noble
les années
and
70,
generous
dont
aspects
nous faisions
of
partie.
companies, oil companies in the
Moi, je suis en
1970s.
74,
I was a part
Mais
of this
non,
era. I joined
les
in
compagnies pétrolières
1974,
n'ont jamais
but
gagné autant d'argent
I'm
qu'à cette
afraid I'm
époque
going to disappoint you by saying
termes
that the
de
companies
relations par
never
rapport
earned
au
more money
capitaux
than at that
engagés.
time
Ils n'ont jamais
with
été aussi
respect
puissantes
to capital
qu'elles étaient à
employed.
l'époque.
And
C'est
they've
pour ça
never
qu'on
been
les
as
appelait
powerful as they
majors.
used to be at that
C'est-à-dire
time, and that's
qu'elles
precisely why we called them the
contrôlaient
majors,
le politique.
because they
Ce qui
really
paraît,
controlled
pas très
everything,
en ligne avec les
including
propos avec la Donald.
politics, which is not
Ce
perfectly
beau
in line
jeu
with
à
corporate
dire qu'elles
governance, you might say.
contribuaient à calmer les prix, c'est vrai, c'était
So
au
it's
détriment
true
des locaux.
that this price
Saoudiens dont vous
volatility
parlez
was to the
ne voyaient pas la
detriment
couleur
of
du
the
pétrole.
locals. The Saudians
Effectivement,
didn't see the
bien.
color of their oil.
Pour l'Ouest.
Unfortunately, it was good
Mais il est
for
chez eux, le
the
pétrole.
Western countries,
Il leur
but the
appartient,
oil
il nous
was
appartient
in
pas.
their country,
Et on a tendance trop
and it didn't belong
à
to them
considérer
in a
ces pays
way.
comme des greniers
We
ou des
consider
vaches à lait.
these
Ce sont des pays dans lesquels il y a,
countries as
en
milk
Arabie
cows
Saoudite, je
in a
crois,
way,
25 millions d'habitants.
whereas there are 25
en
million
Iran,
inhabitants in
70,
Saudi
c'est
Arabia,
pas que de tout
70
petits pays.
million in
Et
Iran.
donc,
These are
ils ont aussi leur
not
vision
small
sur
countries by any
l'utilisation de la
means,
matière
and they
première.
have their own vision about
Personne
how to
n'imaginerait
use
d'aller dire aux
their
États-Unis
raw
comment
materials
gérer leur
and
matière
commodities.
première.
Nobody tells the United
Particulier
States how they're
fabuleuse
supposed to
réserve
use
de
their raw
charbon.
materials, especially
C'est qu'on dit
their
qu'aujourd'hui,
coal
l'Arabie Saoudite,
reserves.
c'est les États-Unis
And
pour le charbon.
this is why we say
Et
that
l'Arabie Saoudite
Saudi Arabia is
pour
the
le
equivalent
pétrole.
of the
Donc,
United
pour revenir
States
à la question,
when
oui,
it comes
il y a
to
eu
coal.
un changement. Oui, il y a eu
So,
une
to answer your
volonté de ces
question,
pays
yes,
de
indeed,
s'émanciper,
there was a
au même
change. There
moment
was a
d'ailleurs
desire
où
on the
ils
part
trouvaient,
of these
entre guillemets, leur
countries
liberté
to
sur le
emancipate
plan
themselves, to get more freedom and more autonomy on
à partir
the
de ce
political
moment-là,
front.
on voulu prendre le
And
contrôle de leurs
simultaneously, we wanted
Moi, je
to
pense,
take over their
et c'est ça qui
gas
m'étonne
reserves.
toujours beaucoup,
And this
c'est
is
que s'il
something
avait
that
fallu
always
l'OPEP,
surprises me. Had
les
we
prix
not
du
had
pétrole auraient été
OPEC,
non seulement
oil
beaucoup
prices
rapidement beaucoup plus
would
hauts,
not only have
mais en
been
plus
very high very
beaucoup plus
quickly,
volatiles.
but they would have been
Puisque,
far more
on parle
volatile.
beaucoup du pétrole, et c'est
Because we
normal,
talk
parce que
about
c'est une
oil
énergie
a lot,
indispensable.
obviously,
Quand vous voyez
because
la
it's an
volatilité
indispensable
sur d'autres
energy.
commodities,
But if you look
comme
at
le café
the
et autres,
volatility,
ça fait des
volatility
yo-yos
of the prices of
phénoménaux.
other
On en
commodities
parle
as
moins parce
well,
que, effectivement,
prices go up and down all the
en tout cas,
time.
moi, je pense qu'on peut se passer du café pour vivre.
Even
mais
when it
pas
comes to
du pétrole.
coffee. But we
En
can
tout cas,
survive
pas
without
pendant
coffee, but
encore très
unfortunately, we
Donc, ce
can't
qui s'est
yet
passé,
survive
c'est
without
simplement
oil.
de
That's the
réajuster
problem.
les prix
So there
avec
was a
un juste
readjustment
partage
of
entre les pays
price
producteurs et les pays
with a
consommateurs.
more fair
Ensuite, les
sharing
pays
between
consommateurs, la
producer
preuve,
and consumer
c'est qu'ils ont trouvé que
countries.
le prix était pas très
Consumer
cher,
countries
c'est qu'ils ont rajouté des taxes,
found
alors
that
plus
the
ou
prices
moins
were
selon
not
les
high
pays,
enough, so
moins
they
aux
added all sorts
États-Unis,
of taxes,
beaucoup plus en Europe. En Europe, on
more
est monté jusqu'à
in
70 à
Europe than
80%
in the
de
United
taxes.
States. In Europe, we imposed
Des pays
60
européens
to 70
sur un produit
taxes.
vendu.
European
Quand vous allez
countries
expliquer
themselves
ensuite aux
imposed
Saoudiens
these taxes
que,
on
c'est
oil
trop cher,
sold. And when
ils
you
vous disent, je comprends
tell
pas,
the
le prix
Saudians that
beaucoup
oil is too expensive, they say, but I don't understand. I earn a lot less on my oil, which belongs to me, than you do. So how am I supposed to understand your woes? Of course they won't be able to understand. I wouldn't if I were in their shoes either. So you have to stop this discussion on the how and the why of things. However, there was an interesting development recently with oil prices soaring this summer. And what was surprising, and this is noteworthy, is that these oil prices continued to soar even when the economic crisis was already at our doorstep. We were already in a sort of recession, whether in the United States or in Europe or even in Japan. Japan hasn't really been impacted by the financial crisis yet, except through the stock exchange, but their growth rate is 0%. They don't say it's because of the oil prices or because of subprime. They say that it's of a cyclical nature. So, oil prices were not responsible for this crisis because oil prices continued to soar despite everything. This means that there were still people capable of believing that oil did have some value. It was not mere speculation. A survey was conducted on the practices over the summer, which concluded that there was no speculation in the strict sense of the word. Buying oil when we believed that it would become a rare commodity, that was the perception of the market at least, was synonymous was tantamount to buying shares, for instance, stock, good stock, or buying stock when it was at a specific price, but this price, oil price, was far too high and it started coming down. But unfortunately, all oil-related projects are getting more and more expensive. So if oil prices drop too much, we won't be able to invest in this industry anymore. So $147, of course, is unacceptable. But right now, currently, we're at about $80 a barrel, which is not enough for marginal products as it is. It is not enough at all for unconventional energy-related products. And considering that we have to pay the price for greenhouse gas emissions and pay huge amounts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're not going to make all these and be able to make all these investments if oil prices are not reasonably high. I'm not threatening anyone. This is a reality. Everyone should understand this carefully. For years and years, we've been told that energy prices are going up to bring down consumption and reduce the problem of global warming. And then all of a sudden, people say, what about the consumers? So we have to be expensive to bring consumption down, and at the same time, we have to be cheap because of buying power and because of the environment. It's a bit too complicated.